Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our MSCI Research Seminar, Sharing Cities, Sustainability and Institutionalisation. I'm Darren Sharp, Senior Research Fellow here at Monash Sustainable Development Institute. It's my real pleasure today to have friends and colleagues from the other side of the world joining us here in Melbourne from Lund University. We've got Professor Oksana Mont, Dr. Andrius Plepys and Dr. Yuliya Voytenko Palgan, who are going to be presenting their findings from their project on urban sharing, sustainability and institutionalisation pathways. I'd like to first begin our session today by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands we are gathered today here at Monash University, and pay my respects to elders past and present. We've got an action-packed seminar for you today with three presentations on the urban sharing project, which is studying the sharing economy since 2018, and I think the project is culminating this year. Is that right, Oksana? So it's in its final year, and this project's done some amazing work with stakeholders from 5 cities, various interviews with sharing organisations around the world, municipalities, a whole range of workshops, a whole bunch of academic publications and other publications that have come out of this important project. Firstly, today we're going to hear from Oksana, who will present an overview of the project, talk about business models, a framework for evaluating the social sustainability of sharing organisations, as well as highlights from their study on responses of sharing organisations to the COVID-19 pandemic. Andrius Plepys will present his conclusions about the sustainability impacts of sharing economy organisations, and Yuliya Voytenko Palgan will talk about the role of municipalities in governing the sharing economy. So, without any further ado, I'll introduce Oksana Mont. So, Professor Dr. Oksana Mont is a professor and research coordinator in sustainable consumption governance at the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics at Lund University, which I had the pleasure of visiting, I can't believe, almost 4 years ago now for the Sharing Cities Summit that our friend and colleague Kes McCormick put on, which was an amazing time had by all. Oksana holds a PhD in engineering, a Masters of Science in Environmental Management and Policy, and also in biology and chemistry. And Oksana's main research area is sustainable consumption and production. She combines projects on innovative business models for circular and sharing economy with research on sustainable lifestyles and sustainable consumption policy and governance with high-level policy consulting. Oksana is the principal investigator for the ERC project on urban sharing. So I will stop sharing my screen, Oksana, and hand over to you. We'll have 15 minutes from each of the speakers, followed by 5 minutes of Q&A so people can get their questions out. I will be facilitating that Q&A session after each talk, and then we'll come together as a group at the end for a good, hopefully 25-minute, half an hour panel conversation, which I'll also facilitate. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Oksana.
Thank you very much, Darren. It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much, Darren. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's been a long flight, but it's also, we feel very much welcomed here from the very moment we stepped on the Australian soils, but everything is also so calm and nice. We have, although, program full packed the whole week. And I will start by just introducing the project. So as you mentioned, the project started in 2018. And the idea here, and of course it's not moving.
Do any of those buttons work?
Here. The project started in 2018, and our goal is to understand how sharing business models are designed, what the sustainability impacts are, and how they get what we call institutionalized, but basically how sharing as phenomenon gets normalized and becomes a part of our daily life. In our research design, we wanted to look also at how the landscape of sharing phenomenon evolves and changes across cities. And we decided to look at 5 global cities, including Amsterdam, Toronto, Shanghai, Seoul, and Melbourne. And we've chosen these cities because they represent very different, we thought, ways of a very different landscape of the sharing economy, but also a different way how cities deal with sharing economy emergence. And then we look in this project at 3 sectors: space, so accommodation sharing, co-working spaces, parking spaces; mobility, where we look at car sharing, ride hailing, sharing of bicycles and e-scooters; and then physical goods sharing, basically everything from toys, toy libraries, clothes sharing, do-it-yourself tools, and so on. And we have a double kind of unit of analysis, which includes both the platforms themselves, but cities also. So we are looking at platform level. We are looking at both what we call resource owners, those private people or companies that own resources they would like to share with others, and resource users, those people or organizations who want to get access to these resources. The role of a platform is to organize this dual market, a business model where there is a resource owner and resource user, and a platform, a marketplace where these two meet. And then the role of cities we see is very diverse, but they can be regulating the platforms or providing a fruitful ground for them to grow and develop. In this report, in this project, it will be finished in last August 2023. So we have so far produced 4 reports from 4 cities: Amsterdam, Melbourne, Toronto, and Shanghai. Also, you are able to access snapshots, which is just a 2-pager for each city, where the main conclusions are gathered. So when we were looking at the sharing business models, we started, of course, from definition. What is sharing economy, what is included and what is not. There are publications available on that, but the main point is that we decided to look at ICT-mediated companies. Originally, we wanted to look only at organizations where there is the resource owner has non-pecuniary motivation for ownership. This means that first we excluded the companies that are providing sharing services, but then we realized if we exclude them, then we have basically almost or very few platforms to study. So we included both then B2C and peer-to-peer companies. We look at the temporary access, so where there is no transfer of ownership. We look at tribal resources, so anything which cannot be shared at one time, like music can be shared. So music is excluded. And then we're looking at tangible goods because we want to look at the sustainability assessment of these business models. So of course, as with any research, we needed to develop an apparatus. How do we map the organizations? How do we study them? In order to map the landscape of sharing in different cities and also to understand how these business models are working and how they can also be designed, then we developed a framework which we think can be useful for both mapping, evaluating these platforms, and also for can be useful for startups when they are developing their ideas. Then they can use this morphological framework to understand what kind of features they would like to have in their business models. Then Corona came, which was very unexpected. And although we had freedom in Sweden, not unlike many other countries, we thought that this was really this black swan that you never expect, but then suddenly comes and you have to rearrange your life completely. And so our PhD students, Stephen Curtis and some others, were saying we cannot just, ignore this. We have to do something. And then we thought, we saw examples of platforms coming up with solutions of different kinds. And we thought, okay, we maybe should look at how they got affected by Corona, what their response strategies are, and what are the long-term implications of this pandemic on sharing. So we did an online study where we looked at mobility space and goods sharing of different platforms, international, some of them, European and North American. And we had 10 companies in each of these categories, both B2C and peer-to-peer. And of course, the short-term impacts, we were doing this pandemic, so there were already results, kind of first statistics available on how much different has been affected. And the accommodations completely shut down. Airbnb was barely surviving, and many ride-sharing companies were going also really bad. Co-working spaces were trying to survive and so on. So that was kind of easy to look at how they were affected. But then we started looking for some sort of conceptualization for framing and structuring the organizational responses that we wanted to look at. And we needed to look into crisis management literature. And surprisingly, what we mostly found was not the actual response strategies of organizations to different types of crises, but rather communication, how they communicate about what they're doing, but not exactly what they're doing. So, which led us to develop this framework for organizational responses to different types of crisis. And we divided them responses that orient themselves to customers, so users, organizations, or responses that deal with the address issues within organization, and then responses that are towards the society. And so this is, I had just examples here, but in user-oriented responses, we saw increasing of hygiene standards, supporting physical distancing, implementing communication and education campaigns towards customers. Organization-wise, they were trying to manage daily operations in different ways. Some were adapting existing business models, and others are performing kind of more long-term strategic work using the time that they had maybe when their operations were not in full. And then society-oriented responses were offering support to societal actors. Both Uber and Airbnb engaged a lot and helped medical workers with accommodation, with transportation to hospitals, and many small local companies were engaging, for example, delivering food to elderly or people who were kind of stuck at homes and so on. And also managing partnerships, because many of them had to establish new partnerships or had to put on hold the previous or existing ones. So when we looked at compared between the sectors, we saw that mobility sort of continued, especially car sharing, much more than ride hailing. In spaces, we saw accommodation sharing was on pause, but co-working spaces continued. And then in goods sharing, there was a very wide diversity of how they reacted, everything from pausing and closing down to finding ways to still provide their goods to people. And then in terms of long term, of course, at that time, there were a lot of speculations, basically, but people were saying that the ride hailing and the car sharing would be discouraged for a while, but then will pick up again. The support that was provided by the big and the loud, Uber, for example, to their gig workers, it will become institutionalized, and the conditions will have to improve because of the corona and how the organizations had to react and act towards their workers. Delivery services, they were on the rise during Corona, so they will remain popular and will increase. And then people are projecting that both the driverless cars and drones will be used much more for both mobility, private mobility, and also for delivering goods. And then in social evaluation, I will take it really short, because we were also just looking at, we came to the project with the bigger focus on environmental sustainability, but then also realized how much social sustainability actually plays out in the sharing economy. So we wanted to develop, together with the stakeholders, we wanted to develop a framework for assessing social sustainability. So we've done workshops, but also very thorough literature review to develop this framework with 4 aspects of how to evaluate social sustainability, including social justice, inclusivity, trust, and empowerment, and 18 indicators. And so after that, since we developed this framework, we tested it in interviews with organizations. But then I see a much bigger potential for it to really adjust. First of all, the framework is general enough, but then we do have these 3 players because of the business model, the platform, the resource owner, and the resource user, who will have might have very different experiences of the social sustainability of the platform. And then also the 4th actor is missing, which is society, or for example, a city. So there are ideas, the project is finishing, but we might be able to take this framework further and to actually develop an assessment tool if we can find an organization. It's a bit like with eco-labeling and this kind of assessments, but one can think about or imagine a social sustainability index where this could be kind of with the help of IT solutions become an online tool and app where both the sharing organizations can assess their social sustainability. Cities are becoming more interested in this, and also investors. For them, it's the money, and they need to know that the companies they're investing in are socially sustainable. So this, we'll see how it goes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Oksana, for that wonderful presentation, overview of the project. I'll invite participants in the room here, but also on Zoom to, if you're online, maybe just chat me a question or raise your hand and I'll get to you. But I wanted to ask about in the observations you might have made, Oksana, over the years in terms of the sort of role that different maybe Yuliya will come to this with the governance side of things, but maybe we could pick on the gig worker side of it, because that still gets a lot of attention, especially when someone gets injured or sadly a delivery driver gets run over in an accident or something horrific like that. Are there cities that are doing that really well in terms of managing those interests in an equitable way? People want convenience to getting Uber Eats and other delivery or whatever else, but obviously there are people who are putting their lives on the line going through traffic to get there, and it's very dangerous. Which cities are doing it well, do you think?
I'm not sure I can really answer. They're so different, and they are different well in different ways. And Yuliya will talk about different examples. And Sweden usually has quite high labor trade unions and everything else. But even in Sweden, we have this issue with the gig workers and actually the problems that these platforms are causing, especially the food deliveries. So I wouldn't venture into saying that somebody is better than others. I think all cities are struggling with the same issues.
And on the accommodation side, obviously the likes of Airbnb took a massive hit, but it seems they've recovered quite significantly, if we can call it, in a post-COVID sort of era. What have you noticed on the accommodation?
Yeah, there is interesting because there are different trends there. So there are, before we were talking about staycation, it's the best to stay at home and not go anywhere. Now people are talking about with this corona, then the trend started where people go away for Corona to be in quarantine somewhere and where they can work, but also have leisure time in the evening. So now it's also all these trips combined where you can work, but also take some days kind of together and have some vacation. So I think it will bounce back quite quickly. And also what we saw in this work on the response strategies, that for hotels they laid off people and now it takes them time to get people back and maybe educate, train them, new ones and old ones again. But with Airbnb, they are kind of there and waiting. And what was also interesting is that what I mentioned, the people who, the host with multiple listings, with multiple accommodations, they didn't buy them. They borrowed money from the bank, and then when they couldn't generate income during Corona on this, so they had to get rid of them. So we saw also statistically that there were much less, fewer people with these multiple listings, simply because it wasn't a good business for them. So that's also kind of, I think that this is positive because we want idling resources to be used, not.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question from Jill on Zoom saying, thank you, Oksana, really interesting. I wonder if you are looking at unintended consequences of transitioning buildings to new uses for a sharing economy, e.g. Airbnb transitioning buildings from long-term housing to short-term hospitality, and the impact this can have for affordable housing.
Yeah, I'm sure cities or the housing associations, they didn't foresee the impact this has on the cities in the long run. Gentrification, I mean, all cities are suffering. In all cities we've been, everywhere we've seen a hike in prices because of the moving in of short-term accommodation. So I don't think, and cities, I mean, they were kind of reacting. Very few cities were proactive enough to foresee this. So we are, although there are a lot of experts, but when it comes to foreseeing and being proactive, I mean, the only proactive way we saw with the city councils that they became stricter and realized that they needed to put a cap on the amount of days, for example, accommodations can be listed and so on.
And those battles can be very, intense.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
Seeing what happened in cities around the world with the platforms themselves trying to, reduce any caps on availability of like full homes for, short-term accommodation and that sort of thing, and huge battles between that and residents who want to maintain the quiet sort of nature of their neighborhoods and so on. And
But also it's, so far it's been, for many cities, it's good perhaps for some private individuals, for the city, for the view of the city, for the livability, and also even for tourists, when we see that there might need to be a cap on tourists for some cities. Amsterdam center became completely run over by tourists. So and
Barcelona.
And Barcelona, So there are a lot of these cities, and then you wonder, okay, even for tourists, it's not pleasant to go there anymore because just too much. So the amount of tourists needs to feed the scale of the city itself because of this accommodation sharing platforms.
Are there any questions, Rob? Do you want to go? Do we have time, or do we?
Yeah,
sure. While we're doing this, maybe we can swap presenter slides, and Andrius, if you want.
Just a question about the cases you picked. I guess two questions. One is, these are all global, well-connected big cities, particularly in the global north. So I wonder if you can reflect on what the implication would be for generalizing some of your findings, given that there's also a lot of sharing, similar kind of sharing in the global south. One of my students looking at sharing in the motorbike taxi sector in Indonesia, and a similar study where you can see that basically the global pandemic was a shock, but then these sharing businesses that they use basically social media to try and do institutional work to institutionalize a sector which is still sort of part of the informal economy in many ways, and basically making promoting drivers as the heroes of the pandemic, because they switched to different services, including transportation services rather than transporting people. So so that's sort of maybe a question in terms of why did you get to pick these 5? And if we have time, not sure, could also be something for the latter part of the discussion. Would be really interested to learn about if you see any specificities in these 5 cities. Do you observe similar dynamics in all 5 of them, or is there some place-specific dynamics going on as well? I imagine that, for instance, sharing approaches in Amsterdam might have been quite different from Melbourne, as an example. So do you observe that in your cases?
That's right. If I start from the second one, so yes, on one hand, we do see many of the same sharing platforms appearing in different cities. And then also, but cities react quite differently. Some are a bit more proactive and kind of up to speed. Others are waiting longer and then come in, and it's when it's only a restriction that is kind of possible, or licensing. There is also very different. We had also a previous project with 3 other cities, London, Berlin, and San Francisco. And there it was also interesting because San Francisco, we thought that's the cradle where it's all started. And it did start, the platform started there, but the city it was only a very short spike of interest in the city council. And then when we came, there was almost nothing there. With Seoul, we had similar expectation. And it is quite an interesting case where it's very city council steered and helped and enabled, and there are investments and so on. But there are 2 different types. So one is the private for-profit, a lot of projects going on their own, and then the city governed, a lot of them not-for-profit projects, and many also for-profit. So there is a very different role of the city. And then Amsterdam has been quite, they were quite proactive. They organized, had a unit that worked with these issues. But now also the life changes, and now the corona kind of put stop on that unit, and people moved on to dealing with other issues. On the other hand, the issues of sharing are dealt with now in different departments, which is also good because then it kind of becomes the part of everyday normal life. What was interesting also with Shanghai, there the role of the government is much more prominent, and you feel it. But then the definition of sharing economy is completely different. There, anything online is basically sharing, whether it's sharing or not. So there was also very interesting, and also again this pro-capitalistic large all bike and different other kinds of bike sharing and the car sharing. So there is the volume that steers, and then the government supports because there they see sharing as part of the economic growth idea and something that gets the profit. So very different reasons, and why cities in Sweden is much more pro-social agenda that drives the engagement of city councils, and a lot of the big and the loud that dealt with at the governmental level, national government. So the cities are not dealing with, whether we should ban Uber or not. This is dealt at government level. So yeah, very differently. And then with developing countries, I think I feel they're very different. We had Sao Paulo originally, but then we realized for different reasons we shifted to Shanghai. But I think there is very different. It's a different context. So I would have another project just looking at sharing in then developing economies or industrializing, because the context and the ideas are very different. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Oksana, for that. I'll I'll hand over now to Andrius Plepys. Dr. Andrius Plepys is an assistant professor at the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics at Lund. His research interests are in the circular economy, sustainable consumption, circular business models, product servicing, and the sharing economy. Andrius also teaches courses on the principles of different environmental assessment approaches. And currently, he's involved in international research projects exploring sustainable lifestyles and the impacts of the sharing economy as ways to facilitate sustainable business models in the Swedish manufacturing industry. So over to you, Andrius. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Darren. Pleased to be here. Thank you. So, yeah, I'll try to be brief. And although my slides will be rather detailed, please treat them as more a story, what we are working with, and probably some indicative findings. So conclusions about impact is a big word, but insights into the impacts is probably a more correct word. Our departing point for this research, focus on environmental or sustainability impacts of sharing economy, was from observation that in the literature, as a result of hype about the sustainability role of sharing economy, and both a lot of about positive impacts on the environmental, social, economic side. But overall, there is not much numbers on that. There is not much empirical evidence, a lot of anecdotal cases, research based on case studies, or research applying modeling with very diverse boundaries and scopes. So we thought it's a good idea also to try to contribute a little bit with our own insight on the impacts. And this is an interesting field of study because sharing economy has interesting regional effects, economic effects, and environmental, of course, and social. And the interest is that we could, if we are able to model the entire economy and then single out the role of the sharing economy as a sector within that bigger economy, probably we can better attribute cross-sectorial impacts, including job migrations, for instance, the effects of savings for sharing users, extra earnings, respendings. So focus was on those effects that are both direct and indirect. And we're interested in from the perspective of consumption more than from the production side. And you will see, I will illustrate with a car sharing example. But overall, we can say that, well, if we have a three-dimensional graph about the three dimensions of the sustainability impacts, they are all case specific. So even if we take the same case of a sharing platform in two different cities, the effects could be very different. They could be both positive or negative. So a lot of specificity is in the ultimate outcome. There's both the city context, segment specifics, where these platforms work, the incumbents, how they interact with the incumbents, business model designs as well, important, and then the many multiple variables. So it's very difficult to conclude about that. So, but more insights is more interesting to provide. And in our research, we use different perspectives on different levels. Micro level is from the position of an individual sharing or a household sharing. Meso is sectorial or city level, and macro, what is the role within the national economy? So how does a sharing as economic activity carves its space in local economy, plus today it's possible also to model its impacts abroad as well. We're interested in trying to measure rebound effects on at least two orders. First order is direct price effects, being basically a typical example when Uber became cheaper than taxi, we tend to drive more Uber than taxis before. The same with Airbnb, we tend to travel more. And there are also economy-wide effects, but in this research, we so far don't model them because of the lack of data, which we cannot create. This data is created by the statistical accounts on a national level by the central statistical bureaus. But essentially, we're focusing on two main issues on the consumption side, that we might be sharing wrong things, perhaps. So assets, we may share assets with high environmental intensities in certain parts of their life cycles, for instance. The other issue is that we may share things wrongly. They could be the right things to share, but they are wrongly shared. Because of the pricing because of their ability to extend access to different goods and services, the ability of creating extra disposable income, so the spending issue, and also the effect on lifestyle changes that you can afford, say, living more far away from city center, from jobs, etc. So there are different positive and negative, but essentially those two issues are interesting in our research. The same is on the production side. The sharing creates new additional economic activities is an add-on to the existing activity. Sharing competes with incumbent businesses, basically oftentimes eroding the existing sectors. Say taxi has been eroded in many places by Uber, and hotels were affected by Airbnb. And also, but on the other hand, sharing creates more competition and also stimulates innovation, new business models. So there are also both positive and negative effects on the production side as well. In our research, we use two existing methodologies: the LCA, life cycle assessment, and here we don't contribute with the methodology development. And we also apply the top-down type of assessment approach, which is environmentally extended input-output analysis, the IO-LCA input-output analysis. Here we do not develop too much on the methodology side, but this is a novel application because input-output analysis is not very well applied for the sharing economy measurements. And so far we found only 4 studies. Over the past 15 years, there are only 4 studies, and our probably is the 5th. So that's what we are using in our research. And well, I will not spend time explaining what input-output analysis is for the audience. You can read that, but basically this analysis it exploits the existing economic tools of picturing how the economy looks like. And this tool has been in use since 30s. And all countries have these statistics. That's what the statisticians do. They gather information about the exchanges between different sectors, and they put this information in large tables. So transport sector, for instance, depends on steel sector, glass sector, rubber sector, fuel sector. And that picture of economy in form of a matrix is a map allowing you to model what happens if we increase demand of transport suddenly. So there will be ripple effects in steel, rubber, and other sectors, including agriculture. So the idea is that we want to use this ability to use the existing statistics, which is for free. The problem here is that sharing economy is not a sector. However, it will be a sector. And we have seen and interviewed also statistical organizations in the UK, and I know that Australia is thinking about that, UK, Canada, China, at least at the NL4. So it will take years, but it will be a sector. How it will be defined, I don't know, but it will be defined and will probably end up in SMA, Statistical National Accounts. I will illustrate some of the research results with one segment of sharing economies, the car sharing sector. And this is the case of Amsterdam, where we got very good empirical data from a company which we deemed as a typical model company for peer-to-peer. And according to that data, we also scaled it up, its impacts on the national level and city level. If we talk about car sharing, what we know about it is that, well, it induces changes in travel behavior, the modal shifts, vehicle kilometer distances, occupancy rates could be different. But it also induces other transport mode design changes, perhaps changes in fuel efficiency, may have effect on the age of vehicles, etc. And indeed it does. If here are examples from some literature, some study in the UK, which compares the age of a regular average UK fleet, and different colors represent different bands of age. The intense green is very young car, red and gray is very old car. So the upper bar is the average fleet, and then the age bar for the national car sharing clubs. And we see that car sharing clubs are dominant by younger cars, basically, short-lived, younger cars. That is more fuel efficient, probably. Newer technologies, by the way, have slide about technologies as well. That shared car tend to be hybrid or full electric more than the average fleet as well. Just an example, it could be very different in different places, but this is a clear trend. The same goes for emissions, really. They are less prone to heavy emissions, and this picture is about the Euro standard emissions. The higher Euro number is, the less emissions it is per ton kilometer, basically. So shared cars, they do have higher emission standards than the average fleet. However, being rather good in facilitating nice, young, and fuel-efficient cars, car sharing is not used a lot. Annual average driving distance of an average user, this is a ballpark figure, but 300, 500 kilometers per year only for a member. Average travel distance is short. There are a lot of inefficient driving for returns of vehicles, up to 15%, this is an example, or vehicle redistribution. Amsterdam example, we now took statistics, very detailed statistics of our Amsterdam case. Those little pins that go out from the pie, these are shared vehicles, peer-to-peer, B2C, bicycles, and even Uber. Uber takes only 10% of total daily distance traveled in Amsterdam, 1% only, and altogether, together with Uber, it's probably 2% of total distance traveled in Amsterdam. The bulk is bicycles, of course, that's Amsterdam, but a lot of cars and public transport. Public transport and cars is a lot. Okay, and then with some numbers a little bit, that annual travel distances, an average household, for instance, owning a car, only owns a car, doesn't share, drive about 12,000 kilometers per year. A car sharing user still relies on car. The car sharing user may have a car or drive as a passenger as well, but there is a 60% reduction compared to a car owner, an intense user. However, only as a driver in car sharing, it's 400 kilometers roughly. So you see so very low intensities so far. But nevertheless, this is an observation, but with this kind of data and our case study, we scaled it up for modeling. So what are the effects? And we model different scenarios. We model, for instance, what happens if we assume that a car owner surrenders the car and goes to car sharing, or a would-be car owner decides not to buy a car and goes for car sharing, and a car-free person suddenly has a car sharing as an option. And so what happens? And when we simulate it on only one ecological environmental indicator, we simulate it on greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially we see in the upper part is that the emissions of a car owner can be halved if a car owner sheds the car and goes to combined travel mode, including car sharing, public transport, walking, biking, car sharing. However, a car-free person basically only adds the car-related emissions here. So it's an extra opportunity. The blue, for instance, here is the public transport, and the gray and the orange is the additional opportunity for you now to drive a car. So there's a slight increase. So car sharing can both decrease drastically and slightly increase a footprint, depending on who you are, what's your lifestyle, what are the opportunities. If we look at economic effects, I will very briefly show, but no details, very detailed graphs. What we modeled what happens when a car owner shares the car, joins car sharing club, economically. Economically, that means savings. Then we simulated how these savings are spent. And this is basically, one scenario is basically we take a scenario where we simulate likelihood of respending when you direct your extra disposable income somewhere. One scenario is that you equally distribute everywhere, chewing gum, shoes, jeans, or that you're conscious about that now I'm saving $5,000 per year. I will go traveling. So we simulated both kind of scenarios, psychological scenarios. And because when saving is little, you don't notice it. You redistribute. It just melts everywhere. But when you notice it, then you may change your priorities. So you may invest in your lifetime or in your holiday or invest in something, goods or services. So we simulated. But basically, this graph shows following, that car sharers, previous car owners who start sharing the car, they drastically reduce their environmental footprint, greenhouse gas emissions in mobility, but on the expense of spendings in other sectors. So goods and services from agricultural, fishing, financial services, manufacturing, and other. We have 15 sectors modeled. This is a very short graph here. So what happens is that there's a shift. Savings are redistributed in different intensities across the sectors. And basically, there's no big difference whether you are sharing in a B2C scheme or peer-to-peer. Very small difference. What happens to a person who previously was car-free lifestyle and decided to share a car, or has an option now to share a car on top of all the other mobility portfolio that the person had? What happens is that his mobility footprint increases versus that he starts saving in other spending categories. So our input-output type of modeling allows you to kind of, it's not very accurate anyway, but it gives you a direction what happens. So if you have a very accurate behavioral data, spendings, savings and spendings and purchasing patterns, then you will be able to measure the environmental implications of shifting to different modes of consumption, sharing its new model of consumption. Okay, and then we also have finally some estimates. So what are those rebound effects, the first and second order together? And again, don't believe these numbers too much, but they are indicative that the rebound effect can be up to 80%. So basically, it's not a total backfire effect. You still have a saving from car sharing example, say 20% you're saving. And car-free person actually saves even more. So the rebound effect is in the order of 50% roughly. But it's good that you can, when you model this way, you can identify that where the effects are, in which kind of population or user type you can expect bigger savings and lesser rebound effect spending. So overall, it's important. We think it's important to start and be able to measure the sustainability impacts of sharing economy, because it's not marginal anymore, and its effect on incumbents is big, really big. Vehicle sharing platforms eroded up to 90% of taxi businesses in some cities. Hotel industry was affected as well. They changed even pricing. So there are some shock waves there. And the scale is quite big. And we just previously spoke about the impacts on rental prices, and factor 2 or 3 increases is not a miracle. It happened. You can see it in San Francisco, for instance. It was very obvious in some city parts, of course. But basically, to conclude, is that well, how to harness it, and probably Yuliya will talk more about governance, and now Oksana answered already some questions about in accommodation sharing, caping the number of days per year, licensing, zoning, taxing, safety requirements. Even for property developers, there are some restrictions introduced by different cities. Building standards as well, so the quality of life should be okay. For transport, network companies, TNCs, such as Uber, well, some cities ban them. Some issue strict licensing, so number of Uber drivers in the city is limited. Tough requirements to vehicles, age, probably even fuel, don't know, but age for sure. As in Melbourne, it's 10 years. I know you cannot drive 10 years older car in Uber. And then working hours, yes, regulated skill test, safety test, security test. And similar for car sharing organizations, especially a very strong mechanism with parking permits. city have a very strong machine gun saying, I will not give you a parking permit, so you cannot grow. But essentially, our experience is this, that in cases when large sharing platforms are uncontrolled, they can grow very quickly and very often lead to unintended side effects, including rebound effects from economic point of view, but also unintended side effects, especially social, working hours, etc., and then safety, security, and gentrification. So they need to be governed to some degree, not over-governed, but there's a debatable question how much. But we see more, I would argue that I see more benefit in regulating or at least monitoring the effects of sharing economy and trying to turn some knobs there rather than releasing it and go. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Andrius. Really appreciate your talk. I'm conscious of time. Does anyone have any questions in the room or on Zoom? And Andrius, if you're okay, maybe we can move on to Yuliya.
Yeah, I'm sorry for going over.
No, it's okay. We also had technical issues at the start, which, delayed us a little bit. So no need to apologize at all. Maybe while Yuliya is being set up, I can just ask you briefly, and then I'll introduce Yuliya. You talked about sharing the wrong things and sharing things wrongly. And I've always found it interesting that, there's an example going back years ago when the whole kind of movement kicked off that Rachel Botsman gave repeatedly about, people don't need a drill, they just need a hole. And so, you can just go to your tool library and get a drill and so on and so forth. And I really haven't seen that materialize, in a lot of cities. I know there are some fantastic tool libraries and they're brilliant. I don't have one in my community. The one that is famous in Melbourne, Brunswick Tool Library, is on the other side of town from me. But then there are things like, drills, which are very, very inexpensive and you can get probably under $50. So you're just going to go to your local hardware store. So is there a threshold that you can observe in terms of what goods, durable goods, people will go out and make an effort to try and share or get access to and rent and so on, rather than just going to the hardware store and buying it themselves, or other types of examples?
Now, those impulsive buys of drills by the cash register together with the gum, with the chewing gum, it's a problem because you buy gum and a drill.
Yeah.
So cheap, really.
Yeah.
But people should be conscious about the quality and be a bit more rational about spending. Of course. Yesterday we went to the tool sharing library in Melbourne, and we spoke with the inventory manager, and I asked about, okay, what's the inventory there? So basically they focus on high-end goods, but these are donated. So sometimes they are donated some no-brand tools, and they know it's poor quality, but in a way they are obliged to accept if it's working. In extreme cases, they say no. So they are very conscious of trying to share those long-lasting tools with less maintenance, etc. And I think, well, people need education, of course, and rational thinking, and otherwise your garage will be cluttered with tools that you never use. That's it. Plus, when we asked yesterday, how is the tool library informing the population around them? And basically, I think the answer was, well, actually, we don't too much. So people don't know. For instance, the property owner in which the tool library is sharing the premises, they get a nice rate there. And none of the inhabitants in this property are members of the tool library for some reason. Also, I guess it's a matter of affluence, affordability. Also, it's a matter of skill of do-it-yourself. If you don't know how to, you will not take a drill. And I can imagine yesterday, one volunteer is learning how to cut wood. It needs some interest as well. But, people who are not raised with do-it-yourself habit, by parents probably, I don't know, unlikely to join, but there are nice efforts where tool libraries run workshops, how to fix a car, how to fix your, drill. These are important. Education, marketing, explanation, visualization.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, and I'm happy to introduce our third and final speaker for today, Dr. Yuliya Voytenko Palgan, who's an associate professor and director of PhD education, also at IIE at Lund. She holds a PhD in environmental sciences and policy from Central European University and a postdoc from Graz University of Technology. She's over 15 years of experience working in multicultural, multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary teams. Yuliya works in the areas of sustainability, urban governance, innovation and sustainable consumption, and her research focuses on strategies for sustainability solutions in new economies, i.e. sharing a circular economy, the bioeconomy, and sustainable urban innovation and experimentation. And we heard you speak earlier on Urban Living Labs, which is also part of your career going back quite a few years as well. And so it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Yuliya.
Thank you very much, Darren. Thank you for having us here. And I will continue the series of presentations. Today, I'll talk about the governance of the sharing economy and the governance from the perspective of municipalities. So what I present here is research from the urban sharing project, but also from at least two other projects that did similar type of research. So we have more case studies. We have 10 cities where we collected data on how municipal governance engage with the sharing economy, but also trying to understand what are the reasons why they engage with the sharing economy in a different ways. As I said, this is built on extensive data collection with interviews, also mobile research labs. This is something that we are completing also now in Melbourne with the intense study visits, interviews, running different workshops with stakeholders and self-engaging, presenting the research results. Then also, we had a few other activities like focus groups and, of course, literature analysis to collect this data and work with the development of the framework of municipal governance of the sharing economy. So the reasons why we decided that it would be valuable to develop the framework of how the cities govern the sharing economy is that we see that the majority of studies are looking at the governance through the regulating mechanism, while there are many more mechanisms actually how the cities can engage with the sharing economy. Also, the focus of the existing studies is mainly on the big and the loud, the platforms like Airbnb and Uber, and predominantly in one sector or segment, either accommodation sharing or mobility sharing. Geographically, the studies are also focusing on either one country or one region or a small number of cities in one city. Most of the studies were also very much theory-driven, tested maybe in limited number of contexts. So we thought that it would be really valuable to work a bit to collect data from broader international context, geographies from 10 global cities. Now we have data, as I said, and we propose in the end there are other governance mechanisms. There are 5 governance mechanisms apart from regulating 4 more. I will just jump into it very soon, and at least 11 governance roles. That we also looked at the sharing economy in 3 domains: accommodation, mobility, and physical goods sharing. Analyzed data from around 80 sharing economy organizations, and the framework that we have proposed is both theoretically and empirically driven. So we have been iterating it as we went on with data collection and analysis. So this is how the framework looks like. The internal circle is the governance mechanisms, which are regulating, providing, self-governing, collaborating, and enabling. And the outer circle is the governance roles. So I will quickly just explain the mechanisms, but in the next slide, I will also present some of the examples and comparison between this among these 10 cities. Regulating is when the city is engaging through the means of regulation in its role as authority through rules, policies, laws, taxes, bans. Providing mechanism is when the city is providing or not providing tangible resources for sharing economy organizations. It can be in the form of money when the city acts as investor. It can be in a form of infrastructure when the city acts as a host. It can be in a form of data provision when the city opens up municipal data for the public, but also for the sharing economy organizations. And it can be also in the form of owning, acting as an owner of sharing economy initiatives. Enabling governance mechanism is when the municipality is offering intangible resources to sharing economy organizations in a way of providing information or communicating, acting as communicator about the sharing initiatives through the official municipal channels, like on websites or on the municipal website or other channels, or acting as a matchmaker when the municipalities are organizing events, conferences, meetups for the sharing economy organizations to meet with investors or other potential partners that would benefit their activities. Then self-governing mechanism has two roles of the city: sharer and consumer. The city as a consumer is basically public procurement services. When the shared services are publicly procured by municipality, shared bikes or cars are used for municipal employees in their roles at work, and city as a sharer when the different municipal units could share assets among themselves. Last but not least, collaborating governance mechanism is more kind of to the direction in both ways, from the municipality towards the sharing economy organizations, and in the other direction from the sharing economy organizations to municipality. And here we have two roles that we have identified. It's the city acting as a partner when it is partnering up with the sharing economy organizations, and the city as a negotiator when there are certain negotiation processes taking place between the organizations and the municipality. So what we have done is basically we collected or placed all this data from over 200 interviews and also the literature into metrics, trying to code it against those mechanisms and roles, and coming up with this table, which is basically the colors showing that the role of the mechanism is present in a particular city. Ending up with those sorts of diagrams to compare the 10 cities with the colors showing that the role or mechanism is present, while gray areas show that it is absent. So to give in a bit of a glimpse into this kind of cross-city analysis, we can say that when we look at regulating mechanism, it's basically present almost everywhere, apart, I think, from city of Malmö in Sweden. And Sweden is a bit of a special case because in terms of regulations, the cities normally regulate the big and the loud platforms like Airbnb and Uber, but in Sweden, the governance structure is organized in such a way that these issues are regulated at the national level. So then the city would not need to worry or bother in this for these issues. In case of Gothenburg, which is also a Swedish city, the regulator role is present, but it relates to the regulation of e-scooters and the land use by e-scooters and parking and so on that city introduced, and that was done not so long ago. If we look also at the most present mechanism it's providing, it's present basically in all cities. With I think the most absent role there is the data provider. When the city is opening up its data to sharing economy organizations, was present in Melbourne. There is an open data portal in London, also in Seoul. There is an example of that, and in Gothenburg, but other cities didn't have such a mechanism. Also, the city as a host is, I think, can be found almost everywhere, apart from San Francisco, when the city is offering infrastructure for sharing economy organizations. And in most cases, infrastructure or space, and in most cases, this is also the city offering public space for car sharing or for bike sharing to be used to be used in the city. Self-governing mechanism I suppose it's the most absent also that we have found when the city is kind of governing its own routines, its own activities with the engagement with the sharing activities, and consumer when the consumer role is more kind of abundant here in the sense that it is doing this public procurement of shared services. While city as a sharer is less typical, but there were some interesting examples, like in London, for example, we were following a project where the different districts in London decided to share low-use, high-value assets like forklifts or cranes, or even they had this bubble gum removing machine that not each district would own because they're expensive, but then they would not also use it very often. So that they created a shared system to be used among the districts. And yeah, enabling mechanism, it is fully present in Swedish cities, for example, but also absent in some like Berlin and San Francisco. In Swedish cities, it's the communicator role, for example, is an interesting development of it when the city partnered with an NGO. It was called Sharing Economy Gothenburg. It started in Gothenburg. And they mapped all the sharing organizations in Gothenburg on one map. They placed it on one map. So that helped to communicate about those activities and to live them and show to the users and promote and so on. But that initiative was so successful that it was then, it spread then to Malmö as well and other cities. So now even the NGO is not called anymore Collaborative Economy Gothenburg. It's called Collaborative Economy Sweden. And it's kind of running its model in other cities in Sweden. But this collaboration with the city is very crucial in the communication and creating of smart maps. And then the collaborating mechanism, it is, for example, it is absent in Melbourne and Malmö, the partner role, and it is kind of the most problematic one because municipalities have restrictions on how and with whom they may collaborate. And particularly because of market rules and regulations, so they cannot show any preferential treatment. That's why when they collaborate, it's mostly with the community or non-profits, not with the companies or platforms. But negotiator role, on the contrary, it is mainly the negotiation between the city and the platforms about the rules of the game. Like in Amsterdam, there was a long process of Airbnb and the city of Amsterdam negotiating on different cap policies, amount of days that the accommodation can be rented and so on. In Melbourne, there was an interesting case of creating the what is called the memorandums of understanding between the city of Melbourne and the e-scooters coming into the city because they didn't want to repeat the experience of the bike sharing that was not a successful one in terms of the free-floating bike sharing companies coming and just floating the streets with the bikes and they getting damaged and vandalized and so on, and people dump them in the water and so on. So there was this precaution, and it was a successful kind of negotiator type of act they made. But then we also ask the question, why do we see that the whole spectrums that this differ so much and they're in different cities? And obviously there are a bunch of factors defining this. And this is an attempt to kind of structure or to put a list of factors that may stay behind these differences. Structural factors, existing regulations, of course, but also in terms of this multi-level governance, the example with the Swedish situation that I brought up, that at national level the rules are set up for accommodation sharing, for example, or ride-hailing, but also infrastructure matters. If we think about the US, for example, the public transportation system is not so well developed. That also creates an window of opportunity for ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft to kind of fill in this gap there. While in Europe it might not be the case, or not in all countries where the public transportation infrastructure is much more developed. Economic factors, type of economies might matter in like coordinated market economy. Like in Germany, it is much more strict towards has been at least much more strict towards, again, this big and loud, regulating the platforms, while in America it is more liberal market and more welcoming climate for Uber and Lyft. Political factors, for example, in terms of actor mobilization, alliance formations, example of Amsterdam, where we have the sharing economy, ShareNL, the sharing economy. It's not an association, but it is kind of a think tank behind the sharing economy ideas that was very active in pushing the idea of making Amsterdam a sharing city, the first sharing city, and collaborating a lot with the city of Amsterdam to make it happen, and then engaging on board also the sharing economy organizations and creating this kind of dialogue between the municipality and the organizations, and building towards the brand of the sharing city. The same also the examples that I brought about the collaborative economy Gothenburg that partners with municipality in Gothenburg to create the smart map. Sustainability factors, we see that both matter these challenges, but also the aspirations and the goals and the agendas for sustainability, how the cities are governing the sharing economy. So often the challenges that are exacerbated, sustainability challenges, then the regulation steps in with the accommodation sharing problems that lead to gentrification, or we discussed a little bit before also about this taking of the housing from the long-term rental markets and so on. So that's what it matters also. But also the on the other side, the sustainability kind of goals or sustainability aspirations of the cities that they try to kind of more proactively tighten this sharing economy agenda, and that we see in Swedish cities with promoting more sort of community-based non-profit sharing that are standing behind social values that support the goals on social integration, for example, or also in Amsterdam, again, promoting electric car sharing that fits very nicely into kind of climate agendas, and the policy, the green agenda for car sharing has been created there. Cultural factors, it's a huge number of different things there, but the cultural dimensions by Hofstede seem to be helpful to also explain the differences. To give an example on one of those dimensions, power distance is how people perceive inequalities. In China, for example, this is really high number, it's 80, while in all other cities or countries where our cities are located, it's much smaller, from 31 to 40. So that is also impacting how the decisions are made and what it has for the trajectory of the sharing economy development, where in China we have a much more kind of top-down system in terms of the sharing economy dynamics. If you want to learn more, of course, the websites of the projects, the urban sharing, there was also the sharing the city project that finished last year, where we have Amsterdam, Gothenburg, and Malmo for analysis, apart from the 5 cities in urban sharing. There is an article on written about the framework, but also those who don't have time to read an article can watch 6 films. Each of them is on explaining one of the sharing mechanisms. And reports, snapshots, very welcome to consult this. I would like to thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Yuliya. I'll open up now to anyone in the room who might have questions of Yuliya, and also people joining us on Zoom as well. And then we'll, after that, open up for a short sort of discussion with the whole group before we wrap at about 1 o'clock. So any questions for Yuliya? Go, Rob.
Thanks, Yuliya. That was really, really interesting and great to learn about your research on different governance approaches. My question is how does your talk relate to the previous presentation in terms of the fact that there are different sort of implications, environmental, economic, and otherwise, depending on particular citizens or particular places. And you ended with a call, there's a need to further govern and regulate this sector. How is your work talking to the fact that there's such a diversity potentially, like how can you go about governing or regulating that kind of diversity? Because it matters for some people. It might they're doing good in a way. They're reducing their environmental impact. For others, they're not. So, do you have any? Is there anything in your research that points to approaches that and allow that sort of type of diversity? And
yeah, I think the biggest thing to dissect, we need to differentiate, of course, from between the commercial sharing and kind of this platform type of sharing that became kind of squeezed under the umbrella, and most of community based on not-for-profit sharing, because intrinsically this community based on non-for-profit sharing, it has much more potential for delivering the social and environmental values. It's not the regulating mechanism that is kind of going towards those platforms, and that's what we see also in all cities. They do not need to be regulated. They don't create problems really. Apart, I think, maybe from food sharing, which is outside of the scope of this project, but that there could be regulations related to kind of hygiene and health and so on. So that there where the regulating mechanism plays the role. But when we talk about non-commercial community and non-for-profit, then we see clearly that those kind of provision and enabling mechanisms are very important, and that the role of municipality is important. And clearly the Swedish municipalities, they capitalize a lot on it. So they kind of lift those initiatives. Instead of regulating, they are kind of working much more with the non-profit community-based. They just define the sharing economy is this for us, and they see it more proactively that they can contribute to the agendas on sustainability and so on. This is lacking in some of other cities which are more reactive and more just only see the problems with the for-profit sharing rather than exploring the opportunities with the non-profit. So I think it is very heterogeneous. We clash a lot of different things there, but and also the governance mechanisms work very differently towards different kinds of sharing. So that at least one differentiation that I can bring that could be kind of practically useful. Oksana has something else to say.
If I can respond, very good question. And what we see now is that the sustainability impacts of sharing depends a lot on how these platforms, or not platforms, these organizations or the services are designed. What we see in Sweden and some other countries. So if these services are baked into urban planning, they become a part of kind of conscious effort to provide services and help people avoid driving distances to get what they need and provide what they need where they live. This drastically reduces the impact, becomes kind of normal part of everyday life. If you don't have 10 parking places connected to your multiple house unit or multi-flat unit, but only 2. Instead, you have bike sharing provided. When you have other kind of services right at where you are. So now we see, and already 4 years ago, you visited this Sege Park, and we have this kind of projects popping up everywhere, where this idea of sharing, so maybe sharing didn't get institutionalized as we wanted, small kind of, but we see that it becomes a part of urban planning for the future, and people are thinking about it, also including circularity and repair and so on. But this is kind of a hopeful conclusion in our project. Otherwise, it's very negative.
Any other questions from anyone, either in the room here or on Zoom? And while people are having a think, I might just speak to your point, Yuliya, about municipal government, especially playing an enabling role, which was seen especially in cities like Seoul, where initially there was like a very strong vision coming from the former mayor, who sadly passed away in recent years, and they really were trying to catalyze, I suppose, and support more of the pro-social sharing economy organisations and startups and cooperatives and others. Has that continued with the change in administration there, or have you seen those in other municipalities similar support from local government in actually trying to build that ecosystem rather than just saying we're going to regulate the corporate actors trying to support more of the community-based sharing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have received a bit different perspectives from different interviewees, and which was a like triangulation in action. So what is happening now in Seoul, and how bad is it, or how good is it compared to? So some were really critical, particularly researchers saying that now the whole sharing economy sector is just left unprioritized, and it's the new government is very much neoliberal, and it's supporting commercialized sharing and so on. Then when we started talking also to other actors and the city itself, so they still have, they reformed, kind of removed maybe was it Innovation Bureau, or yeah, I don't exactly remember how was it Social Innovation Bureau that was from the start, and then it's now something else, the Innovation Office, Social Innovation. So there is still structure at the level, but they also at the city, so they kind of distributed the previous government, I guess that's there also, what they have done, their heritage. They put different departments or units that are working with specific issues like shared mobility or bike sharing, car sharing. There is accommodation sharing, so they are still in place. Maybe there is no so much coordination on the kind of strategical level. I'm not sure it's needed so much either anymore, because it is kind of already there, and it is developing, and the programs are functioning, and the support is there. There are grants, and it is there, but it's maybe not like top on priority in a sense that it's not so visible. I could assume that we could also count it as a next step of institutionalization, that it becomes, and people know much more. And they also gave example from both the researchers, but also the city themselves, that people know now about those activities, and they have been actually advocating, because city wanted to remove, I guess, support for the bike sharing, but people went and kind of protested and said you should not do it. So there is a legitimacy that has been built among the people, and now it's very crucial, because then they are pushing also the government to continue to, and the government reacted in the way that people wanted, so they kept the bike sharing and support and so on. So this is how we talk also about, like how do we institutionalize? We need to build legitimacy from different parts. It should not just come from the government. It has to also be bottom up, and then you have acceptance among the population, but also the structures at the kind of national level, municipal level as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of time for today. I'm very grateful to all of our speakers, Oksana, Andrius, and Yuliya. Thank you so much for sharing with us your amazing research over the last few years on the Urban Sharing Project, and hopefully people get access to those links. We can also share those, distribute them to participants later, and wish you well for the rest of your time here in Melbourne, and look forward to seeing what great work you continue to do in the future. And thank you to everyone for joining today, for joining the MSDI Research Seminar Series, and look out for the next one coming up soon. So have a wonderful day. Thank you.